So last video, if you remember, we talked about the process of evicting a tenant. Not something we like to do. We're in the business of attracting and retaining tenants. But sometimes it becomes inevitable. You have a tenant that's not paying the rent, or maybe paying the rent always late. Could be that they're interfering with other tenants. Could be they're loading too many people into the unit. Could be they're involved in destructive behavior. Whatever the reason might be, you use an N4, give them the prerequisite notice, and evict the tenant. But we saw also last week, there's time when the tenant is fine, there's no problem with the tenant, but it still becomes necessary to evict the tenant. And that's in those situations where the property is needed for the existing owner, or more likely a new owner. And what happens when the property's on the market for sale and a buyer puts in an offer, often that buyer requires the property either for their own use or for the use of their immediate family. And there's provisions in the Residential Tenancies Act to give the tenant 60-day notice, if it's a month-to-month tenancy, from the start of a payment period. So if they pay the first of the month, then at least 60 days from the first of a month, you can give them an N12 notice, and that says, I require the property for my own use or the beneficial use of the beneficial purchaser. And they have to move out. The problem is, it's always difficult to count on what a third party is going to do. And what happens if they don't move out? You can picture somebody moving into the area, or maybe moving across town, whatever, comes to the closing date, they got their moving van full of furniture, they pull up in front of the property, and the tenant's still there. What are they going to do? You've got a problem. And depending on how the offer is structured, the problem is either primarily the seller's problem or primarily the buyer's problem. If there's nothing addressing it in the agreement of purchase and sale, the agreement of purchase and sale calls for vacant possession. And so if the seller can't provide vacant possession because the tenant didn't move out, even though, according to the agreement, he's provided the notice and done everything he's supposed to do, he's in breach because he hasn't provided for it. More likely, in the agreement of purchase and sale, there should be a clause in there saying, in the unlikely event that the tenant fails to move out on closing date, the buyer agrees to complete the transaction, assume the tenant, and continue with the eviction process. And then you've addressed it. Now you know what's going to happen if the tenant does not move out. Well, the problem also is there's provisions under the Residential Tenancies Act to evict the tenant, but it's a slow, arduous process. It can take 6 to 8 months. In fact, we had a situation one time where a property was on the market for sale and it was occupied by a tenant. We brought in a buyer who was moving into the area from the west, as a matter of fact, and they required the unit to live in themselves. We found out sometime prior to closing, the tenant had no intention of moving out. In fact, the tenant had purchased the property themselves, and they'd arranged closing for 2-3 weeks after the deadline date when they were supposed to move out because they were planning on going to a European holiday. But here's the thing. They called the Residential Tenancy Board, and the board said, no, you don't have to move out. It's going to take them months to get you out. So here you've got the board that's supposed to be enforcing the law in the Residential Tenancies Act, telling the public, break the law. We don't care. And so you've got a problem. Well, there's one thing that you can do, and I should interject something here. I understand that you may be watching this from a jurisdiction outside the province of Ontario, across the country, and in Canada or in the United States or wherever you're seeing this video. And so what I'm telling you is the Ontario legislation, but you should have some form of similar legislation in your jurisdiction that you want to check on. But there's also a form called an L2. And an L2 is called an application to end a tenancy. And this L2 can be submitted to the board anytime up to 30 days after the deadline that the tenant was required to move out. But the thing is, it can also be issued, or at least submitted, earlier than that. And so what I would advise you to do is, when you serve the tenant with an N12, at the same time, fill out an L2 and submit it to the board. What that does is it gets the mechanism moving without having to wait for that 60-day period. So it isn't going to guarantee the tenant is going to be out, but it's going to increase the period, or it's going to shorten the period of time that you have to wait for the gears to move, if you like, and for them to evict the tenant. So what you want to do is use the N12 and notify the tenant, and at the same time use an L2 and send it into the board. Now, there are other options besides evicting a tenant because you need it for your own use. You can evict the tenant because of a mutual agreement between the landlord and tenant. You can evict the tenant because you're going to do an extensive repair and renovation to the property. You can evict the tenant because you're going to change the use of the property. It's no longer going to be residential. We're going to look at some of those things in the weeks ahead. I want to thank you very much for investing your time. I look forward to talking to you again next week.